and welcome back to the B2B Insights podcast. Today, we'll be talking all about how to achieve world class quality in B2B research. And you are hosted today by myself, Kim Arend, and Pete Mullarkey. Hi, Pete.
Hey, Kim, how you doing?
Lovely. Nice to see you. Always great to catch up with you. I feel like you're always such a ball of joy, so I'm quite looking forward to this.
Yeah, it should be really good fun. There's so much to kind of unpack today in the world of quality. Let's see where we get to.
I know how we're ever going to fit it all in. I guess maybe if we start with both of us introducing ourselves, I can go first. So, as you already heard, my name's Kim, and I've worked in B2B International for quite some time now. I don't like to admit it, but I guess at this stage you'd call me a seasoned researcher. I'm a research manager now, and I'm originally from Germany and came to B2B International as a young student, back then an interviewer, just like Pete as well. Did a lot of interviews and therefore know a lot about what good and bad quality can look like firsthand, and have then moved through the analysis and all these other wonderful parts within research. What about you, Pete? What's your journey?
Oh, it's been very B2B focused. So I came out of university and joined B2B International as a telephone interviewer like yourself, Kim. And since then, I've worked on the fieldwork operations side in the real kind of depths of looking at research on the analysis side as well. But now my role really straddles both the kind of the operations and the research side, because I look at all our partners who we engage with. How do we look at who can work in which regions of the world? And I've seen the good and the bad like you have. So it would be really good to talk about that.
Yeah, I think for me as well, I've also worked quite a bit on B2C research in the last few years because we
Mm.
do venture into that field sometimes, and it's quite exciting to see the difference.
It really is, and I think my background is much more on that kind of quantity side of things. And I know you are a qual expert in our organisation, so we'll come at it from two different ways and two different angles. But
Oh,
in
yeah.
terms of today's conversation, we've got a number of things we want to really touch on, and it's just to really work out what world class research is. So, Kim, do you want to tell us all about what world class research means to you?
Such a hard question to answer. It's such a broad question. If I was to play devil's advocate, I always say it's not really quality, but qualities, if you want, if you excuse the pun there. Because if you look at, especially if you look at quantitative measures and you're looking at a spreadsheet of data within your Excel, I often find that if you're only looking at one score, that doesn't really tell you enough. You need a little bit of context around it. You need to look at all the different qualities along one interview from a respondent. And so, world class quality is all about seeing that bigger picture, I think. What about you? How do you define it for yourself?
For me, it comes down to within our role, we have to gather the data from somewhere. And how do we go about doing that? And how does the data then impact in the boardroom? So for me, it's all about that quality that we build through trust. So, talking to the right people, making sure they give us as much information as possible, so that we're then able to push through and find these nuggets of insights that really help kind of drive companies forward. It's the joy of kind of the end of a project is when you hand something over that you're really proud of because you've got full trust and clarity in what has been put forward.
Yeah, it is really about thinking about all the different stages of a design project, like you said, a
Mm.
research project, because you sometimes feel that you when you think about data quality, you just think about the data collection, but really it starts in different parts, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later.
Mm.
I also have a little surprise for you, Pete.
Oh, hello.
I've got some quick fire questions for you, which hopefully we're going to talk about a little bit later. So I'll leave a little bit of a cliffhanger there. So you're going to have to listen to the full episode to find out the answer. But my first question to you is, how much, when we talk about online panel data, how much in percentage do you think we remove on an average project?
This is such an interesting question, and just to kind of prefix it as well, and why are we asking about online panel data? I think the reason we focus on this is it's such a great method for collecting lots of voices quite quickly, but also because of PII, because of lots of different reasons, we now have to not share who has completed those surveys. So there's this kind of veil of trust, and this is why I talk about trust and quality so closely together. Who are the people that are actually doing these interviews, and how do we prove who they are? So I do have a bit of an insight in the answer to that, because we have a lot of feedback that is given from the partner networks that we work with, the major online panel providers that we work with. And with B2B, we have such a target on our back because our surveys incentivize far higher than in our B2C cousins world. So we do have to have that mindset all the time of, if someone's going to fraudulently try and complete a survey, it's much more likely to be a B2B one than a B2C. So looking at the data, we'll come and talk about manual checks later. Also, there's lots of things that we can do on the technology side up front. So the long-winded way of saying the answer to this, back in 2023, I believe it was around about 50% and above, which is really shocking because I've heard at some conferences recently, people in the industry talk about 30% kick out from a B2B perspective, and in B2C that's down around 8 to 12%. And there's different reasons for that, and we'll touch on what the differences might be there. But yeah, if I'm going to put a dart in the dartboard, I'm going to go 50% for this particular answer. But I know that's changing in this year for some of the reasons which we'll talk about later.
Interesting, interesting. Well, I guess hopefully my second question to you is going to be a little bit more of a surprise, maybe one that you don't know the answer to. So, obviously, we all know that generative AI is taking root in lots of different industries, and certainly research is no exclusion to that. And experts now predict that IT spending is actually going to go up significantly in 2024. And half of this increase, which I'd like you to guess in a second in terms of percentage, comes down to investments into data centers, which of course affects us. We need to think about how is the data that we collect being stored, and how does that affect, certain needs like electricity, data safety, and all those things that sometimes we forget about because the project is done, and then we don't really tend to think about what happens with the data next. So how much do you think the IT industry is going to have to invest in terms of percentage increase in the next year?
I mean, it's got to be in the three digits. It's I think I could be completely wrong here, but if you look at what has been happening before, IT investment is so big, but every boardroom now is talking about what AI to invest in, what to put together. The biggest company in the world now is a chip manufacturer. It's not the software or the technology players behind it. So, I'm going to put my neck out. I might look completely daft and say 300%.
I'm very intrigued to see what other people think about that as well. So feel free to drop us a message. I don't know if you can comment on podcast platforms, but
Oh,
that would be
can
quite
do whatever
interesting
they
to
want.
see.
Oh,
Great.
yeah.
Well, we'll get to those answers later on. But yeah, I suppose we should talk about how do we define world class quality? We've just touched on that. But yeah, what's next on the agenda, Pete?
We really want to touch on the kind of the B2B breakdown versus B2C. So really, I'd love to know, Kim, because you've got this kind of feet in both camps. How do you see that difference of what quality means in different spaces?
I think, I guess the initial thought that people always have is that it's easier to do B2C research. And so, hence, surely the quality will be easier to achieve because you've got so many more respondents to sample from, right? In our data lives, we are all consumers. Even a B2B decision maker is a consumer at the end of the day of something. But I think when we step into the B2B world as a consumer, because we are still, in a sense, a consumer in the B2B world, we are purchasing products, purchasing services, whatever it might be in your industry. But I think there happens this switch in your brain when you make B2B decisions. You are a little bit more deliberate in the way that you make decisions. Journeys take a lot longer. We know this from doing research ourselves. And so there are also more people involved, more factors. You got to think about your company's reputation, that you're sticking your neck out for that. And I think that's the real difference here in quality. I would argue, from having done both types of research, that in B2B, once we find the right people to answer our surveys, whether that's online or over the phone, I would argue that we get better quality because people are more careful in what they say. They think about it a lot more, and they are more deliberate, as I said. So I think there is a difference, but it's maybe not the one that you would expect. How do you feel about it?
I agree. I honestly feel that in B2B, we really have to make so much more of the individuals because we don't speak to as many. The target audience is not as broad as Gen Pop or whatever it might be in terms of the whole gamut of everybody is a consumer. Whereas in B2B, if we're looking for, I don't know, an IT decision maker who works for a FTSE 500 company, who in the last 2 years have introduced a new cloud platform, which is a typical B2B brief we see, that's going to be quite a small population of people. And then they're quite senior. So you've got to look at, we'll talk about methods shortly, but we really need to get the most from those voices. And because we don't always speak to them very often, we need to make sure that we get all the information from them that we require. And so usually we're squeezing them like a sponge to kind of get the most from their knowledge base. But because we're only maybe on a study like that going to interview 100 people, every 100 of those voices will count. Whereas if we look maybe at a B2C breakfast cereal study, they might interview 10,000 people. So they're much more, even though we'll still be looking at a quant methodology, that quant volume is less. And so each voice has a higher proportion in the different cuts that we might have. And that's where I think there's lots we need to be aware of around that target audience and getting that right from the outset. And that's where our quality really comes in, because every brief we take is we break it down and we look at, well, who is the right person to speak to on this, and how do we get to them? And that how do we get to them is critical to then answer, say, the next section we're going to talk about, which is all about data collection methods.
You raised actually an interesting point there that I think often a lot of B2B companies think about. If we only talk to a B2B respondent at a certain time and place, so let's say, for example, after the COVID pandemic or during it, a lot of people said, how much can we trust in this data? Not from an individual level, because we know that these people have been well recruited. As you said, we've built a really nice questionnaire. They are clearly the right people. But how much of their answers are influenced by current trends, by current challenges, and how much should we be guided by that? How do you get around that? Because that's also part of data quality.
Yeah, it's everything we do, we have to really think about it. So we sit with a brief for a while to kind of break it down and look. But I'd love to hear other people's views on that too, because I think it's there's no one size fits all factor for that.
Yeah. I mean, you do have trackers, where obviously you go to customers or maybe the market every year and you see how things change. That obviously gives you that long-term trackable, quantifiable data that then shows you what was maybe a trend and what wasn't.
And that's
But
fine when you've got the sample size to do that. But sometimes when you don't, I mean, we did customer satisfaction surveys where they wanted to track things every month, and they've only got so many customers, and their customers only want to give their views every so often unless they see lots of changes happening. So you have to really plan out the detail in that sample process to again make sure that the quality really sings when the sales managers are looking at a dashboard to go, have I gone up or down? But if their sample size is only based on, say, 4 or 5 voices, it will give you a kind of a small indication. But they're looking more for the individual story. Whereas if we're doing a brand tracking study of, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 interviews, and we can look at something like that when it is closer to that Gen Pop. It might be marketing managers, HR directors in certain responsibilities. They're going to want to see kind of the trend data that's happening at an overall level. And we've always got to kind of break everything down and just look at it from an individual basis and say, actually, you need volume on this, or you need voices and you need depth and you need to really get into the weeds of the information.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the actual data collection
Yeah.
then. How do we gather it? Let's get to the detail. What are the channels that we use and the methods? Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
I do. I love talking about this. So I talk to so many of our partners about who B2B are and what makes us stand out. And our only specialism is we do B2B research. We need to know every single method that exists out there, because if we're looking to kind of speak to tradespeople, you've got to maybe get those on the phone. If you want to do a kind of a C-suite level interview, you've got to go to an exec recruitment company to really understand how you maybe get 10 or so voices there. And then there is the panel world, the kind of the easy drop in, the lower price points that we see in that space. And so all of those different factors, we want to have a full toolkit, because as we go back to that initial question is, when a client comes to us with an objective, we don't want to just pick something off the shelf. We want to make it that it works for them, and that's where you need to know. Okay, we want focus groups. We want face-to-face focus groups in 4 different countries. We want to really look at a branding study that is at the right time, and then a pre and post campaign. Everything needs to be put together in a way that sings to make sure, as I keep going back to, that the boardroom is lit up with excitement when we present that finding back to them. And that's definitely the data collection piece. But just going back, I think before data collection becomes the most important part, I go back to that target audience. And you've always got to think in B2B specifically, how do you get to that target audience? And there's lots of lists out there, there's lots of databases that people have got. And I would say that having good data and relevant and real and timely data leads to good quality, because a good contact list is the new gold. You look at how strong LinkedIn is in terms of its whole network in the B2B space. They've created something that they can lucratively tap into, because that's where people go to find business decision makers. So yeah, I would definitely say kind of lists and databases is the new gold. It's fascinating. Do you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I was laughing along there because I thought about a conversation I had only a few days ago about how, especially in these days where people remove their phone numbers from their email signatures, you can't really gather data that way anymore, which even before then was a bit of an ethical conundrum, let's say. But if we want to play devil's advocate in that way, and also, people are just harder to reach, harder to send an email to. I still remember when I was an interviewer, even back then, I found it hard. And this is now 5 years ago. But I think if I had to go back on the phones now, I wouldn't know how to actually do that, how I ever did that. It's absolutely incredible. And I think also another good point that you touched on was there is not one size fits all. So for one project, you got to go down the route of online because you know you're going to have a greater chance of hitting enough numbers. Whereas for other projects, you want to be much more refined in your approach. And I'm also a very, very big fan of a mixed methodology, I have to say. If I have a project that has 2 different stages, for example. So maybe a qual stage first to explore a few themes that we then want to deep dive into in a quantitative online survey afterwards. I always feel much more confident with the study as a whole because it is about that whole picture that you draw at the end and how you bring everything together and to life. I think if you only have one stage, and let's say it is, for example, an online stage, then sometimes you can be a little bit worried, and it can take some time to get your questionnaire right as well, because you don't really have a natural starting point all the time. Or even within one questionnaire, I would always say it's worth, even if it is a full online study, it's worth including a couple of open questions just for context, just to put yourself at ease and to be sure that you can look at something that feels a little bit more real than numbers sometimes. But that might also be the qualitative person in me saying that.
You're not wrong. I've just come back from the IIEX conference in Amsterdam, and it's a really key point that's been taken away from there, because you've got companies that are saying, "Oh, it's all qual's dead," and I'm sat there going, "No, it's not. It's never going away." People said this years ago, and when online kind of became such a key method, but actually the return has been so strong, and particularly during the pandemic where everything was so unclear in terms of what people really wanted from the outset of doing business. everything changed, and you can't come up with a solution if you don't understand the problem and you don't hear the narrative and what people are saying. And that's me from a quant background. So I love qual in terms of what it can give you to get further down the chain. And it's more about, I think, what's coming next in that space. I'm really keen and excited to talk about some new technologies that we've invested in, because actually what is happening in the online space is it's becoming more popular, but it's a bit of a race to the bottom. So everyone's trying to make it cheaper and cheaper, which is it's a big worry for me, because I really feel that you have to pay people for their time in the right way. And if we're really racing towards, I don't know how, a £20 online interview with a decision maker, you've got to wonder if we've got a 15-minute questionnaire that we've put together there, how much money is that decision maker seeing, and would they really spend their time to complete it? And I'm of the I'm of the persuasion that I sit there and I look at a brief and I look at the cost, and I think, if I was that decision maker, would I do it? And we have somewhere I'm thinking, absolutely. We really do. There's some great incentives behind things. It would encourage me to do that. And I think the incentive world is very interesting, because cash is great, but also in B2B, there's been some different pieces as well that we want to sell. So we want to give people some information about the industry that they might not have been able to get before. And that's really helpful. And it all leads into a bigger process of, why does a respondent take a survey? And we're talking here about what quality is. It has to be enjoyable from the individual's perspective as well. I think we we always appease our clients, but actually there's a real need to kind of turn the lens on ourselves and talk about, I suppose, would we do the survey if we were a respondent ourselves? And we're pretty good at that, but I'd love to know what your views on that are, Kim, because I do think, if we I got to go back to, if we turn the mirror on ourselves and we say, how do we do the best research piece possible? Because we can talk about all these data collection challenges that we face, but I think it's number one that we turn the mirror on ourselves.
I would agree with that. I think especially you said earlier on that the only specialism that we have is B2B, but I think we do have one other specialism that we often don't realize, which is we come from the bottom up. A lot of us, like you and me, have come from interviewing or maybe quality control, interview checking. And I do think that really helps us think about that piece of, is a questionnaire, is a study designed to be enjoyable and to be an easygoing conversation between an interviewer and a respondent. I think having been an interviewer before just helps you so much to think logically about a questionnaire in terms of structure, of flow, of length, although that's always something that's really tricky to adhere to. If we say an interview is going to last 30 minutes, yeah, it's not always going to be the case, because also sometimes you do just get people who actually, which is a good sign, enjoy it a little bit more and want to talk a little bit more. So it's not always the worst in the world, but I think it also helps you then when you are designing the questionnaire and when you are talking to B2B organizations that you're designing these projects for, it helps you feel in control. It helps you feel in control of the quality of the data, and also it then helps you to let go of control a little bit in terms of, somebody else is going to do these interviews, but I've done them before and I know which kind of respondents I'm looking for, and how I can make this exciting for everybody along the journey. Because it's also not just about the respondent themselves, it's making it enjoyable for the people that have to conduct the interview, or it's maybe making it enjoyable for our partners that we work with to pitch these questionnaires to their panels, to their respondents that they're working with, their experts. So it's really thinking about every single person that's involved in the process, I always think.
Yeah, it starts with us sitting down with a piece of paper and writing a really good questionnaire. And nowadays we have to be not just writing a good questionnaire to make sure that the client gets all the answers they require, but it's writing secret questions to weed people out who might not be the right people if we're doing online. And so our screening criteria has changed massively in the last 3 years. All the, I suppose the this the checks that we put in place, the open enders, the fact that we work with partners to make sure that if they've got information they know about people already, we kind of mirror that up in the background. We ask kind of questions at the start and questions at the back and make sure that they match up and that they haven't changed their age or or something else about themselves in the 15 minutes we've spoken to them in. And I think all about that initial questionnaire and screening is critical, because we have to think about it from the first perspective, because we're building that whole quality piece up. And I think what you said about the kind of the quality monitoring that we do, we very rarely talk about it, but we win awards for it, and we should be so proud of the work that happens in that space, because to go through and listen to interviews that we do. So this would be for say a CATI interview or a depth interview that we're doing out of our in-house team. We are listening to 10 to 20%. The MRS guideline is 10. We really try and push for 20% to listen to those interviews to help guide our moderation team. We need to kind of give them feedback, and it's all about making sure that what we're putting into that whole process, from either the conversations we have at the start through to that questionnaire that we've designed, through to briefing our interviewers, and then them starting on the telephones. I mean, we've learned so much in ourselves of what works and what doesn't, how we approach it, and how it has to be a friendly introduction, and it has to have a carrot somewhere to give someone a reason to want to participate. The hardest studies we ever have are when it's that we can't kind of give anything away at the start. We can't tell them why they're doing it. Nobody wants to enter into something without a bit more clarity on what are the benefits for them. We have to always have some kind of pros and cons. And I suppose the question from my perspective is what are you doing in the questionnaire designs yourself at the moment to really improve the quality that we have?
I think one thing that's always been important to me from the start is to run it through with somebody else. I think that's the best check you can ever have. So almost do a trial interview with somebody else and read the questions to them. They pretend that they're answering now. They might not know what the biggest trend in oil and gas is right now, but they can give it a try, and then you really play it out and you see where it takes you, and that helps you with your length. It helps you to maybe spot things that are worded weirdly or that just don't really sit well with each other, anything that repeats itself as well. You really want to make sure that you've only got the best killer questions in there that you really want. And I think also, if we're already talking about, it's one thing to talk about the questionnaire, but if we're talking about data checks, and if we move on to the manual checks that we maybe do now, I can bring back our little question from the start. So well done to everybody who's been waiting for the answer. Little drum roll. So you said 50%, just to remind yourself. So actually, in reality, so yeah, absolutely, it used to be 50% a few years ago, like you said, but now we are working with a few more tools, and you are much better placed to talk about that, so I'll pass over to you in a second. We're working with tools such as Research Defender, which have helped us to bring our manual checks down, which of course means to us that we can rely on a tool that already pre-selects things out for us, and has helped us to bring it down to around 30% now. So tell us, Pete, how do we do that magic?
Well, it's a long process. If we look at the kind of the challenges that we face, and it's not just online research, which we can kind of talk about in full detail, but it can be some of the recruitment to web processes that we do, even some of the CATI interviews. We always are checking every single thing that we want to put forward into our data set. Our data set, as I said, has to be really strong and robust and have all the insights available. But those checks need to be done before someone's entering into an interview, during the interview, and then at the back end of the interview. So how do we make sure, and there's different things. If we really focus on the online side of things, if we don't know who somebody is and they have an IP address and they go into a survey, they can falsify their IP address, but we can first and foremost check where they're based. We can also check how many surveys they've done in the last 24 hours. And there are kind of survey farms of people who are constantly trying to do surveys to game the system, to fraudulently get in behind systems. I was at a talk where Kantar were talking about how they're very much aware that even on their own panel that they're trying to weed out the people who are possibly children in Bangladesh who have watched a YouTube video of this guy over there who's basically put together a really sophisticated method of falsifying where you're based, having accesses into LinkedIn to pretend that you are a CEO of an American company. And those people can make, I don't know, 20, 30, $40 a day if they complete a number of surveys. And the average wage in Bangladesh is around about, I think it's £8.26 a day. So as soon as they take a number of these surveys, they're making so much money. So we're in this system where we really have to look at what is happening at that upfront stage to kind of weed that element out. So IP checks, making sure we understand how many surveys people have done, but also other things that we know about them. So has that IP ever come up on a different platform before and been rejected? And we could really look at taking a lot of that risk out. But it's only so much. There's only so much that these companies can do in the background to really put that element forward. When we get to our questionnaire, it's then on us, as we've mentioned before. One of the things which is we try and do is add branding lists in with some fake brand names. And the really worrying thing, which is where we know this kind of fraudulent process is happening and how we're trying to stop it and how we're trying to get ahead of it, is we've seen that if we put a fake brand name in a brand list, about 2 or 3 days later, that fake brand becomes a spontaneous text box answer.
And not just
And
within that project, but I've seen it pop up from one of my colleagues' projects in mine suddenly that has nothing to do with it.
and it really is a huge worry from our perspective, which is where so much investment was made last year to really put this at the forefront of everything we do, because we're not in the banking sector. We are not being protected by criminal kind of speculations that can be put on things. We are a market research industry. If someone's fraudulently entering into surveys, there's no kind of crime that they're going to be committed of. So we've got this huge kind of issue that we're trying to fight internally. We're speaking with all the big partners. They're well aware of the challenges that are faced, and I think we can't kind of shy away from it. And we're not. We're tackling this. And from the conversations and the numbers that we've talked about, we put forward 50%. Others are putting forward 30%. So we know we're already doing 20% more than anyone else. And now we've got these kind of tools in place to really help us. But the front end, trying to stop people coming in. When they're in, trying to spot that they're not the right person for the target audience, and having lots of tricks and tips in that whole questionnaire. And then the back end is now, I think, the really important one. There's if you really want to hit fraud where it hurts, you don't pay people. And there's a lot of partners that would maybe pay in kind of vouchers, and we see that as a bit of a worry because it's a lot easier to trade vouchers internationally to be able to kind of get financial remuneration for it. But what we're asking our partners in the online space to do is to start to pay people into an individual bank account that mirrors with that IP address. And if they can't, then they shouldn't be. They should be taken off a system. But it's a problem we have in our industry because not many of none of the panel companies that I've spoken to want to do this because they're talking about big numbers, millions of people on their panels. If they actually implemented some of these processes, there could be seismic repercussions in terms of feasibility and costs that can have that knock-on effect. But we're aware of this, we're addressing it, we're challenging the industry. We're not the only ones. We're working with the MRS and SMR to really put forward a lot of work in the background to start to put together a toolkit to help us start to win over that process. And it's been going on for years. This is not the first kind of major issue the industry's had. We just need to have a really clear mindset of how B2B International is doing more than most in the industry to kind of get through that. So
I think we have a very clear action plan, which is always very helpful. I always think, so for me, I have almost in my head, I always have three golden rules of how once the data has been checked, by the various tools that we use, I also obviously, or all of us check the data manually still, because we want to get it up to that high percentage. It just gives us the confidence. And I have three golden rules. The first one, as you say, you want to have a set of rules that you set up. So if you're looking at a spreadsheet of 2,000 records, extreme example, if we're looking at consumer side, for example, then it can be a little bit overwhelming. Where do I start? What do I want to look at? So even already when you're designing your questionnaire, when you're setting up your data checking files, think about rules, whether that is your flatlining, whether it's the time that they spent on certain questions. We can think about if we've presented them with a list of options, and let's say there was 20 options and they've only spent 2 seconds on that question, that's probably a guarantee that somebody's not fully read that. So again, we can think about it on an individual base of questions, especially if we have key questions that we're clear on where we want good data. The second thing for me is also if something looks weird, but that mistake keeps happening time and time again. So maybe we see a spontaneous brand that we wouldn't expect to pop up. Have we forgotten to take something to account in the design stage? Is there something that we can go back to? It's never too late to make questionnaire changes. We should never be afraid of that. And I think that's also an important thing, to just not be scared of trusting your gut. If something seems off, then you should be acting on that and you should be doing something with it. I think sometimes if we do have a project with a lot of bad data, I almost get a little bit scared to touch it again because I don't sometimes know what to do with it. And that's where I think more heads should be put towards it as well, and just think about it together. I always think, I know this is a little bit of a strange example, but it always makes me think of the Post Office Horizon scandal. It comes down to bad data at the end of the day. That was a data scandal. And that was, although a lot of people felt that something was wrong, they trusted their gut, they went against the grain. Now, we're not fighting the big corporate bosses. We're all on the same page, luckily, here. And so we all work towards, good quality data. But at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. You just got to trust your instinct.
mm. there's there's an example which always sits with me, and it was a project we were doing where it's a tracker. We'd done it for many years, and I got this phone call from one of our colleagues who said, "Pete, I don't trust the data that we've got back from this company. I don't think they've spoken to the right individuals." I said, "Okay, well, tell me. We can get in touch with this company. We can ask them to remove those participants. But I always want the proof. I always need to have some evidence of why do we want to remove somebody, because we need to talk it through." Anyway, the reason why they wanted to remove this is because the brands that they'd mentioned, they weren't wrong, but what they were more likely to be, and this was for a medical devices survey, and we were talking to healthcare professionals. The brands that they were all mentioning tended to all be used within the veterinary industry and not the human healthcare industry that we were looking to survey. And because we'd done this research so many times before, this was why we could spot that so quickly. It was like these brands just have never appeared before. Our manual checks are phenomenal because our team is so dedicated to that particular process of making sure we've got that right individual within our survey. That is world-class quality. That example there sets us apart from the competition, because I don't know anybody who would have that knowledge of seeing a brand list and then removing them from there. So that manual data process, and we'll come and talk about technology shortly, but there are so many technology advances and booms, and the noise I've heard in the last couple of days has been seismic in the IIEX about AI. But sometimes you need to understand what's come before to be able to know what you're going to do with the next step, and that's why we put so much time and dedication into that manual process at the back end to really look through every individual to just, as you say, make that sense check, and it really does. But even I'm going to talk now about the kind of the technology that I think is really starting to come through, because we've started to use a few different pieces. And I want to know which ones you've tested already, Kim, in the new portfolio of B2B's technology tools. How's have any come through as really really good for you?
I'll tell you that in a second. I'll just quickly, because you gave me a really nice segue, but then I missed it about AI. If you remember, I asked you at the start, how much do we think the IT
Ah,
industry is going to grow in
yeah,
2024 based on generative AI? So you said, I want to say it was 300.
300%. I said 300%. I looked at it and
Yeah.
I saw something previously, and the reason why I said that was because the amount of spend on AI, the graph is the takeoff in the last 3 years has been
Hmm.
unbelievable. And because you're not people, it's technology, you can go so much faster. And that's why I've said that number. So I'm hopeful, but I'm never confident in that space.
I'm sure there are, you know how it is as well. There are always different numbers out there. So we can debate that point on a separate podcast about data alignment if you
Yeah.
want. But yeah, the number that I found just over this weekend, which was a global number, was 8% only. But I still
Eight.
think, yeah, and eight
I'm gonna have to
is
check your sources here, Kim. That sounds really low.
well. I will share all of that maybe in the podcast notes. But yeah, I think what I thought was interesting in that was also that the article spoke about the fact that in the US, the growth of that is, of course, going to be largest. You know, they're going to really invest into their large data centers. You said also microchip development, manufacturing companies. And I think, of course, what that means as well, and it links to a little bit of a separate point, but I still think it's worth considering, it links to electricity needs. And in the US already, they struggle with their grid capacity. So at a certain point within research, you also got to think about the other areas and industries that you affect and the ethics behind it to a certain extent, and that's whether that's electricity, sustainability. I thought that's why it was quite an interesting angle to look at. If we want good data quality, it means we have to collect more interviews, and it impacts other things. But to come back to your original question, one tool that I've really enjoyed using is an AI program actually that we use to create translations quicker. So, of course, we
Mm.
have our interviewers that are great at doing translations once they've conducted interviews in local languages, which is absolutely fantastic. I always think that we have all of these language capacities in house. But of course, if we want them to stay on the phone and do all of these interviews, they will fall behind with their translations, with their transcripts. And so, what we use now is, a voice recognition system that can translate directly from a recording, and that then gives you a lovely transcript, even with breaks and everything. And I've been using that, and honestly, the speed that it introduces to a project, you can have everything instantly. And that really, again, helps you to reconsider your questionnaires because you don't have to wait 2 days until you see the first interview data, and you can act a lot faster if there are things you want to improve. So I absolutely love that. So thank you for introducing us to that one.
Yeah, that's been revolutionary because what from even when I started on the telephone, the biggest bane of my life was finishing a call and thinking it had gone really well, and then having to type it all up. And if you were doing that from your own notes, or if it was longer and you really needed the detail, you have to listen to the recording, and it can take kind of 400% longer to kind of complete that than the actual time that the interview took. So we're making such a kind of an impact in your time in terms of the research, but also the interviewer's time, to mean that can we talk about how good our interviewing team is? Because we've always got this. We do so many checks and things at the back of our surveys. So once a project's finished with a client, we'll talk about how good our partners have been, and they're good. But B2B's in-house team just scores so highly in our internal perceptions because they
Was it
get what we're after.
9.5? I
Oh,
mean,
it's
that out of
yeah,
10, that's a great score.
it's magic because look, we're nothing without, and it goes back to what is quality. It is asking a question, listening to the answer, and getting that information, and then probing maybe a little bit as well, depending on what the answer kind of comes back with. And that actually leads us to another piece of software that we're kind of undertaking at the moment, which is particularly for our online surveys. One of the big challenges can be how do we get more from an online interviewer? Because I don't know, they're filling in a survey while they're watching TV, they're doing something else, they might be at their desk, but they might be rushed. We might get an answer where we say, what is the most important thing about your business relationship with our client? And they just say, they give us a good price. But what we really need is a probing tool that can go way further than that, because a good price is never really the reason why somebody is giving a business to business decision. It's important, but that's where this tool kind of comes in, because it will read through that. It will work on an AI solution to say, right, I know what that person says, and I can now give another probe or another question that B2B interviewers or researchers haven't written ourselves, but it's straight away in the next window for them to fill in. And it just means that there's so much more context that we can get from really important voices that are out there, but we're not having to hold their hand all the time. And there's more advances that are coming in this space, because we think that there'll be AI interviews that can be done. So you can have a voice recognition that will read you the questions, and then you can have a conversation with them and gather data that way. So that could be revolutionary, but it's not tested. It's not something we're looking at. And I think the new tech that's all coming in is about the really improvements in the actual technology space of fraud validation. But then what we're also really more excited about, because it's all about getting more data and relevant data, is then a kind of these text analytics programs that tap into reading what someone said and giving another question. So much happening. I've been to 3 conferences this year. AI is spoken at every single one to the nth degree, and it's fine. But ultimately, it's a machine learning algorithm, and we do need to be really cautious, because it really depends on what you're putting into something to determine how well you're going to get something out. And I think in B2B, our experience of 25 years, we know that a lot of the kind of businesses have similar spokes on a wheel. They're not all the same in terms of how they operate, different sizes, different operations, but there are things that run through every single company that we know from, even if we're talking to someone in the oil and gas sector, someone in the technology space, down to someone in the industrial lubricants area. We know exactly what the kind of the pain points might be, but actually we need to put the context on top of it. And I think that's where you need a human to be able to take all that expert insight in the B2B space at the moment, before we can do anything else with that, to kind of run it through a program and it'll give you all the answers. I think it will summarize things nicely, but that then gives us the time to really look into it in more detail as humans, really. You agree on that one, Kim? Are you a big AI advocate? Do you think the industry is all going to be AI focused, or do you still think there's roles for people to, yeah, roles in the future for us?
I'd really hope so. I don't want to paint too black a future for myself and my future, but yeah, no, I agree that I think when we find we're in this space right now where we're trying to find a balance between collaborating with AI. It's almost like this new coworker that's entered the room, and now we need to learn how to adjust to that, just like we would to a normal person. So, we're all going to find our ways, and I think that's what's really important, that we find the value in AI, but still the value that we can add as well, which is absolutely non-negotiable. So what's our closing statement then on how do we achieve best quality in B2B research, and what is it?
It's by being really diligent. I think there's still, from my perspective, all about making sure that we eliminate the fraud as well as possible. Trying to take technologies from the banking sector to take that off the table. If we can really just have the right people in an online space, that's perfect. That's why I'm much more of a bigger advocate for telephone interviewing or recruitment via telephone, because you're actually speaking to a real person and you know that they are who they are, and it just really helps. I think there's advances that will come in face recognition and different technologies around that way to help in that space. But ultimately, for me, I want to make sure that the tools and platforms and partners we have just give you that confidence as soon as you kind of come out of field, that you've got exactly what you need to be able to take it to the next stage. And yeah, it's always been. I've always said this. I've been at the company long enough to know that quality has always been our number one factor in everything we do. It has
Yeah.
to be the best.
I think nobody would ever say I don't want good data quality. That's like saying I don't want a nice UK summer finally. So yeah, I can agree that, and I would agree with everything you said. The other thing that I would add is sometimes, and this is maybe a little bit contrary to what you've just said, we obsess maybe a little bit too much with the quality of the data and that we want it. But why do we want good data quality? And I don't mean why would we want it as such, but what is the aim that we're trying to achieve with this project? Because we can gather all the great data in the world, world class quality data, but if nothing comes from it and if it's not digested in an actionable way, which is what we always strive for in our projects, and then the next step would be for somebody to implement something with it. If nobody is there at the end of the line to care about the world class quality data, it's all for nothing. So I think sometimes we need to think about why do we want it to be the best quality? And then we also care about it a little bit more as well.
And just as the final point, we wouldn't have such a good client list who keep coming back time and time again if we didn't have quality running through everything that we do. And it's what makes me proud to work for the organization for so long. It's the right thing to focus on, the right thing to really put forward.
Absolutely. That was a very lovely closing remark. So, with that, thank you so much for listening today. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe on all the usual podcast platforms so that you don't miss any future episodes. And you can also explore a little bit more strategic content around all different types of topics on our b2binternational.com website. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter there. Thank you so much, Pete.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Kim. Have a great day, everyone.